for Say Nope to Dope, which is been an interesting experience. I don't mind telling you, my first foray into anything political, and it has been a challenging experience. And maybe sometime you can ask me about some of those challenges. In my regular day job, I work as a counsellor. I have a master's degree in psychology. I also work as a chaplain down at the port. Not that we get to do much of that at the moment, thanks to the COVID restrictions. I'm a former cannabis user back in my 20s. Before I came to faith, I was a daily user for about 3 years. My mental health suffered greatly as a result of using cannabis. And in the more recent history, not only do I see people with addiction in my role as a counsellor, but worked with an amazing ministry in South Auckland called Te Whaka Ora Tangata. And about 90% of their clients are families who are absolutely trapped in cannabis addiction. And I have to say that in my own extended whānau, there's still people who I love and care about who are using cannabis, and it's having a terrible effect on their life. And so at a personal level, professional level, I come to this with the earnest desire to explore the truth and to look for answers that will hopefully reduce harm.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Aaron. And we'll look forward to hearing from you very shortly. So, Richard, if you'd like to introduce yourself to us, that would be lovely.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me tonight. And my name is Richard McLeod. I'm a human rights and immigration and refugee lawyer. I have about 25 years of experience in representing, I suppose, what you could say are vulnerable people against the state, and particularly in my refugee law practice. I'm also the proud husband to Rebecca and the proud father of 3 little girls, one of whom just came into the world 3 weeks ago. So we're really delighted about that. That's been my beginning of life experience in the last few weeks. And here I am tonight to talk to you about the other end of the spectrum, the end of life and the End of Life Choice Act. And I come in my capacity, of course, I'm here as a Christian, but I'm also here as the spokesperson for a group of around about 200 lawyers, comprising Queen's Counsel, some of the, I suppose you could say that there are some of the finest legal minds in our country who have signed with us, also top legal academics as well. We have a variety of views about euthanasia per se. Some of us are pro, some of us are against euthanasia. That doesn't matter to us. All that we are concerned about is the safety and the impact of this particular law, which the New Zealand public has been dished up by our politicians and asked to vote on. And we are unanimous as lawyers in our concerns about this act and about the impact that it is going to have on the weakest and most vulnerable members of our country. And so I propose tonight to just take you through the key issues as we see it. There are many of them, but I'll just devote my time to addressing 3 in particular.
Great, thank you, Richard. Well, just as we get underway, let me share with you, again from the government website, information. Let's make sure I've got that loaded up here. No, so referendum. So it just dropped off. Okay, here we are. So this is, I'm just going to take us now through to the government's own website that they have put out, advertising. We're giving information from, and bear with me for a moment as I just click that on. Here it is here. So this is the referendum.government.nz website, which they're trying to give information supposedly about the different perspectives and answer questions related to the 2 referendum that are up for consideration at the election. So here we have the 2 issues, cannabis legislation and control referendum. This referendum will give the public the opportunity to vote on whether recreational use of cannabis should become legal based on the proposed cannabis legislation and control bill. And if you click on that link, again, you can see more information, plus I'll just do that quickly. You can see more information You'll be asked to, when we come to vote, there'll be just a yes or no. Do you support it or not on that issue? And the same for the end-of-life choice bill. And then there's information down here plus a question and answers. So that's the information that's available there. And so I'll just click on that one as well, as you can see. So there's again, they've put this out trying to be impartial. That's my understanding of that. So you can go there to understand a bit more about things. But for now, I'm going to invite Aaron to begin our presentation. Again, we are recording this, so if you want to keep your video on mute and audio on mute as well. And also turn your screen as Aaron begins to speak. He won't be using PowerPoint, so he'll be speaking to us. Turn your turn the speaker view on, and that way you'll get a larger image of Aaron as he communicates to us. So Aaron, it's your opportunity to share with us. Thank you.
Well, good evening again. Let's, before we take a look at some of the arguments, perhaps make sure we understand what this bill is proposing. Essentially, it's proposing to establish 2 new ways for adults over the age of 20 to access cannabis for recreational use. One is the establishment of a chain of shops that will sell a tested and regulated cannabis product with a maximum THC of 15%. I want you to remember that number. That's going to be important, 15%. And you'll be able to purchase 14 grams of that a day for personal use. In the old language, that's around half an ounce, or in reality, much more than people would ever actually use in a day. You'll also be able to grow cannabis in your home. You'll be able to grow 2 plants per adult, a maximum of 4 plants, although the legislation does not say how large those plants can be, and cannabis plants can grow very large, as high as a hedge, or how strong those particular plants will be in terms of their THC. THC is this active ingredient in cannabis that makes you high. And so you'll be able to give away 14 grams of cannabis per day to friends in what's been dubbed a green fairy. So this is the 2 sort of essential aspects of it. It's a conservative type of commercialization. Shops will not be permitted to advertise their products both out the front or in the store, a bit like some of the tobacco or cigar shops you may have seen, where really you can't see exactly what they're selling, very plainly advertised from the outside. As I say, 20 will be the legal age for consumption of cannabis. So that's kind of essentially what we're talking about, and you can ask for some clarification on any points as we go along today. Where Richard is probably being very kind to you and focusing on 3 points, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to try and tell you everything in the time that's allotted. What I'm going to do is tell you the headlines that you might have heard in the public arena, but also add to those headlines the whole story. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not going to scream fake news when you read the headlines, but you'll understand by the time I've told you the whole story why it is I don't necessarily put as much weight behind the headline as is being offered. So this talk is called The Headlines versus the Whole Story. And the first headline you may have heard is that 80% of Kiwis have used cannabis at some point in their lifetime. Now that stat comes from 2 excellent world-class longitudinal studies that have happened right here in New Zealand, the Dunedin longitudinal study and the Christchurch multidisciplinary study. And they are both cohorts of around 1,000 New Zealanders born in the 1970s. So they're kind of my age, in their mid-40s now. And it says that 80% of them have tried cannabis at some point in their life. And you'll hear that trotted out as an argument that basically says most of us have tried it. The law isn't working from keeping us from using cannabis. Okay, first point of clarification, the whole story. Ministry of Health says 80% isn't the number they found. When they did a study back in 2012, they said it was 42% of Kiwis had tried cannabis. Now that seems more realistic. I certainly believe that 80% of my generation have tried cannabis. I struggle to believe that 80% of my father's generation have tried cannabis. But even if it's 80, it's still not the important stat. It doesn't really matter, does it, if somebody puffed on a joint 30 years ago but never touched the stuff again. The real question is, how many people use cannabis now? And the Ministry of Health stat is 15% in a 12-month period. In that same period, 80% of Kiwis over the age of 15 used alcohol, but only 15% used cannabis. Now, I'm not here to wave the flag for prohibition. It has its flaws, but a law that is deterring 85% of Kiwis every year from using cannabis might not be as bad as is being promoted. You will have heard this headline that cannabis turns ordinary Kiwis into criminals. In fact, the Make It Legal campaign has a meme at the moment that says, if you're planning to vote no, you should turn yourself in, and lists all the places that there are police stations in New Zealand, trying to be funny about it. But that's essentially the point that they're making, is that technically to use cannabis makes you a criminal in New Zealand. And if I'm going to concede a point, that yes, technically that's true. But what's the whole story? Well, the whole story is that last year we made a change to the Misuse of Drugs Act. And we took the police policy of the last 20 years and we wrote it into the law. So now in our law, it says that if you're caught smoking a joint, you're not to be given a criminal conviction, that you're to be treated as a health problem, not a criminal problem. And it's written into law that the police are to devote their energy to locking up those who grow and sell cannabis, not those that use it. And in reality, we haven't really been making criminals out of people for a long time. In the last 3 years, only 16 Kiwis have received a custodial sentence for cannabis possession. And even today on Q&A, you may have seen my brief appearance on the telly today, the law expert was saying only over 200 people last year were convicted of cannabis possession as their most serious crime. It's always interesting they put it that way, because they are trying to dodge the fact that actually cannabis possession is often put in the list of charges to beef up the charges when police are trying to secure a conviction. It's almost never the case that anybody gets a conviction solely for using cannabis anymore. And our arrest and conviction rate has fallen by about 70% over the last 10 years. So we don't really practically make criminals of people anymore. And we think that's good. We don't think that you should go to jail or get a criminal conviction for smoking a joint. That's not the problem. The problem is the people who grow and sell. You will have heard perhaps the headline, though, that the law is applied unfairly towards Māori, and in particular young Māori males. And it's true, and it's terribly wrong that that is true in New Zealand, isn't it? It's unacceptable that any law be applied in a way that targets or victimizes young Māori. But the reality is that the changing of one law that currently only convicts a couple of hundred people is not going to be the law that destroys the systemic racism that might be in our system. Now, here's the whole story. If young Māori are concerned that the cops are targeting them now, you wait till legalization when the shops start targeting them. Because you see, the experience from overseas is that everywhere that cannabis gets legalized, the shops get set up in the poor side of town, not the rich side of town. Because you see, in order to make money, you have to go where the heavy users are. And sadly, Māori are disproportionately represented as users of cannabis and as heavy users. And so we can be sure that the shops will be turning up in their neighborhood, targeting them, addiction for profit. The worst scenario, just for the record, in Denver, Colorado, is that in the poor sides of Denver, the poor suburbs of Denver, there is one legal cannabis dispensary for every 47 adults. Now, it won't be that bad in New Zealand, but it's just a reminder of the fact that the industry will target the poor. You might have heard this phrase that cannabis is harmless. And I think when many of us hear that and think that, we're maybe thinking about a product from a long time ago. Remember how I mentioned THC? THC back in the late 60s, early 70s, in what was dubbed Woodstock weed, cannabis that people were using back then only had 3% THC. By the time I was a user in the 90s, it was more like 8 to 10%. And now the average street product is between 20 and 30% THC. And when I did a meeting in Invercargill recently, a Yes campaigner was bragging about his plant that was 28% THC. And if that weren't bad enough, when we move to the edible products, suddenly we're talking about 60% to 90% THC. And these high potency products are the ones that are triggering the most severe mental health outcomes for people. They are much stronger, and of course it's no longer a plant. It's a series of products. It's waxes and oils that are made, vapes, edibles, it's lots of things. It's put in soda drinks, chocolate bars, all kinds of places. You may have heard the headline that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. I think it's fair to say that it's a different kind of harm. Perhaps we'd say it this way, that alcohol very much harms the body, but cannabis harms the mind. Professor Mary Cannon, she's from the Royal College of Surgeons in Northern Ireland. She says that cannabis is now the single biggest environmental predictor of the onset of schizophrenia. The single biggest environmental factor in schizophrenia. It's a serious, serious problem. And let's be honest, alcohol is a public health disaster. And so the last thing we really need is to add a new public health problem. Now, there's a really important reason why it's been so difficult to rein in alcohol. And that is that alcohol has powerful lobby groups whose existence is just to protect the financial interests of the industry. And you can be sure that cannabis is legalized, that they too will have lobby groups protecting their interests. You may have heard this, that cannabis is mainly safe for those who are over 25 years old. Actually, that's really true. Cannabis doesn't have anywhere near the harmful effects on those who are over 25. But here's the problem, that the research says that the average age that people try cannabis for the first time is 19. It's in that period where your brain is still developing that cannabis is its most dangerous. And that's the ages of 15 to 25. And that's why the proposed law has split the difference and put the legal age at 20. But an article in the New Zealand Medical Journal said that this was arbitrary, because either if you wanted to make it safe, you should have made the age 25 or just made it 18 like alcohol. You see, it might be safe for those over 25, but they're not the big users. The big users are our young people, and they aren't helped by this legislation. And young people are 4 times more likely to develop psychosis and a cannabis use disorder, which is the technical name for addiction. And so this law means that they'll end up having to stay with the black market. The legal stores won't be technically selling them cannabis, although I suppose many of us realize they'll find their way of getting their hands on it, right? And so the overseas experience has been that where cannabis is legal, teenage use goes up. And I've got a chart here that if you ask for the slides, you can see for yourself that the legal states in the US, their usage rates among teenagers are higher than all the states where it's still illegal. So this law does very little to help young people. So you might have heard this headline. This is really important. I want to clarify this one. But Aaron, haven't you heard that use among 15 to 17-year-olds has halved in Canada? Okay, slightly boring, but Canada, Health Canada, their health department, uses 2 surveys with respect to cannabis. They developed one after legalization, simply called the Canada Cannabis Survey, and that's where this stat comes from. And it was 3-month use, and it did halve. The problem was that in the actual survey, this stat was marked use with caution. And that's because there was a real sample size problem. In fact, they refused to publish data from that 15 to 17-year-old group for daily use because they said the data was too unreliable. But Health Canada has been using another national survey for decades to measure cannabis consumption called the Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey. Now, what did it find? Well, it found in the year following legalization that use among 16 to 19-year-olds went up by 22%. That among 20 to 24-year-olds, it went up by 16%. And by 25 and above, it went up by 10%, all since legalization. See, that's the whole story. Now, you may have heard from Canada, oh, but Aaron, apparently the black market's finally been overtaken by the legal market in Canada. And it's true. Stats Canada said it was 50.5% the legal market. But what you won't hear from the Yes campaign is how it happened. Well, it happened during lockdown, that people started buying cannabis online, and surprise, surprise, the black market does not have a lot of websites to visit to buy online. But more importantly, they decided this was a chance to compete with the black market, and they crashed the price of cannabis. You see, one of the big problems is that in this environment, the legal product is usually a lot more expensive Before lockdown, legal cannabis was $10 a gram and black market cannabis was $5.90. Well, during COVID, they decided, the legal stores that is, to crash the price and match it. So they developed what they called the $6 value product. And that's how they outsold the black market. But here's the problem. Two of Canada's biggest cannabis companies posted significant losses. Kronos posted a $35 million loss, and Organogram posted a $99 million loss. And both of those losses were just for the quarter. So you've got to ask yourself, who's going out of business first, the legal market or the black market? You cannot sustain that kind of loss very long at all. But Stats Canada also found that only 29% of users were willing to buy all of their cannabis from legal sources. So 71% bought some or all of their cannabis from the black market. Okay, thinking money now, right? So you will have heard this more recent stat that legalization is going to generate all this tax income that can be used on health and education. Well, here's the problem. In Colorado, the Centennial Institute said for every dollar that you generate in tax income, you've got to generate $4.50 in social harm. You see, the problem is it just simply doesn't work. You can't help addicts by making addicts. And in fact, the whole logic is broken, isn't it? The logic says that we're going to raise tax money by selling cannabis to adults so that we can use the money to teach teenagers not to do what the adults are doing. Well, that's a broken logic, friends. The reality is that this Burl report that's come out recently, where Andrew Little was forced to release it, did in fact point out that there'd be $330 million in GST alone, which means that they valued the industry at $2.5 billion, that they've confessed that there'll be an increase in cannabis use from 14% to 18% of the population. And on that note, this is where, you know, I've heard so much in all the debates I've been involved in that our law won't be like the US. So people have scoffed when I've pointed out that in Colorado, there are twice as many cannabis stores than all the McDonald's and Starbucks combined. But that Burl report said there'd be 420 cannabis stores in New Zealand, 125 here in Auckland, 125. And that 420 stores, that's more stores than McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined. And I think that's a real problem. One of these cannabis stores in every neighborhood. And then finally this, that legalization will increase access to medicinal cannabis. It's so important that we talk about the fact that this is actually not true because medicinal cannabis is already legal. And so a no vote is going to send a clear signal to the government to fix that law, because that's a bad law. They've made this law to make medicinal cannabis legal, but they've put it out of the reach of the sick and suffering. It's really expensive and only a very small number of products are available. That law needs to be addressed. It doesn't need to be addressed by bringing in a new recreational cannabis law. And the New Zealand Medical Association, listen to what they say. Cannabis is a harmful drug that causes a range of health and social harms at the individual and community level, and the NZMA does not condone the use of cannabis for recreational purpose and opposes this legalization. The New Zealand Medical Association is opposed to this. The New Zealand Respiratory Foundation are opposed to this. This is not good news. You don't grow your own medicine in your backyard. You don't smoke medicine. In fact, they've pointed out that growing your own plants undermines the whole idea of this, which is supposedly that we want cannabis to be tested and regulated so people know that it's safe. We don't know how strong people's plants are going to be. And so we can't have people self-medicating and bypassing the medical system and saying, I don't need to see a doctor. I've decided for myself that that's what I want, is to take cannabis to get high as my pain relief. So just to be clear, here's the whole story. Cannabis is more dangerous now than ever. That overall use and use among teenagers goes up after legalization everywhere we looked, and we've produced some research based on 250 university and government studies that's been checked by academics at Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. So this is serious stuff, folks. We're only talking about recreational, not medicinal. The black market isn't going anywhere. In Uruguay, 7 years on from legalization, the black market is still 70% of the sale of cannabis, and it's out of control in California and Colorado. And, for us who care about people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, knowing that this law targets the poor, that this law will expose the young who don't get a vote. That's why when I learned all of these things, and I've done my homework, folks, I've read these studies, I've pored over them, I've checked, I've debated internally with our team, are you sure? And I'm sure this is what actually happens. Things get worse. So what are we suggesting instead? Well, interestingly, when I was in a debate on ZB on Wednesday, the president of the New Zealand Police Association, Chris Cahill, said that back prior to the global financial crisis, the police had had incredible success at getting teenagers to stop using meth through their education programs. And I said to him, so to be clear, education programs work even when a substance is still illegal. He said, yeah, we'd made meth the dirty drug, he said. But then they ran out of money to fund the education program, and they couldn't do that anymore. Well, we're saying, you know what? We don't need to legalize, but we do need to improve our health and education approach. And so that's what we're advocating for. We think we've had two really excellent developments in the law, that Misuse of Drugs Act that's written the police policy into law, medicinals in the law already. Those were both last year. Why don't we give it some time to see if those new changes to our law will bring about the kinds of results that we're looking for? We've got to give it more than a year to work that out. And when we're looking overseas, legalization is still so new that the trend data isn't there yet. And as Bertha Madras from Harvard told me the other day, it took 100 years to work out how devastating tobacco was. So we won't see for some time just how harmful cannabis really is. But it's too soon, it's too much. And so that's why I represent 25 different organizations. We have different opinions about things like decriminalization. We're all of the same accord that we think medicinal is good. And we all agree that legalization makes things worse. And so we're asking those who are watching this, who are reading this, to seriously consider the data, because we want to see harm reduction, and so do the yes people. But legalization is not the way to get that harm reduction. Increased use and harm reduction, they don't go together. So I hope that wasn't too much. You can have a look at all the slides some other time, but that's the whole story. That's what we're talking about, friends.
Fantastic. Hey, well, Aaron, thank you so much for that presentation. Very insightful and great information you've passed over to us. A couple of questions for you, because I've heard comments from a number of people saying, they've found it a bit incongruent between the government wanting to clamp down on the, anti-smoking and so on, and yet here they are kind of legalizing cannabis use. What's your understanding of the percentages of, because cannabis will be available in ingested forms, baked goods. It won't be available, I understand, in beverage form. I think the law says that will be not available. But do you have an idea or sense of what the stats, how much will be smoked, how much will be eaten? How does that kind of compare?
Well, let's talk about the edible issue. Let's remember that one of the problems and the difference between the topic that Richard's bringing and the one I'm bringing is that this law doesn't exist yet. So yes, currently beverages are not permitted, but we don't know what will happen at the end of the process. So we can't be sure what will be or won't be in the law, but you're right, today it's not. And the edible products, the New Zealand Police say the problem is that this current law empowers the black market to specialize in edible products because they won't be available. But what we do know is that it's still the case that around 70% of cannabis users still smoke, but they don't smoke in the traditional way. Well, they still smoke joints, but mostly they actually smoke through using a kind of a bucket, through inhaling the smoke through a funnel. They use dabbing now is popular. Which is using a kind of a crystallized wax version that gets heated with a blowtorch. Vaping is popular, which is why the New Zealand Respiratory Foundation is so opposed to this. They're saying, hey, the vaping law was a shocker. So yeah, it's incongruent that we can be smoke-free. Now, I've heard Chloe Swarbrick say, oh yeah, but we're going to get a reduction in smoking over time because she's hoping for a reduction in use. To which I would simply say, who in their right mind would be queuing up to start a cannabis shop if they didn't believe the market was sticking around? Market's not going anywhere. The people who want to make money are in for this because they see a growing market, not a shrinking one.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, the other question I want to ask you is, I don't know if you saw tonight, but on the news, the president of the Principals Association in New Zealand came out saying that they were supportive of the legislation, that they didn't want this to be cannabis to be a legal issue, but a health issue, and therefore not to penalise young people with criminal, cases and so on. So I've heard that argument. People saying this should be seen as a social justice thing, not a legal thing. What's your response to that, and maybe even to what the president of the Principals Council has said today?
Yeah. Well, he should know that it's now written in our law that our policing policy is exactly that. It's to be treated as a health issue, not a criminal issue. Nobody has interest in locking people up for smoking joints. My best childhood friend is a senior police officer, and he said to me that if any of his 200 officers that he has charge of ever arrested someone simply for smoking a joint, there'd be a please explain meeting in his office the next day. He said that would be a waste of police resource. We don't do that anymore. We haven't for a long time. So I think in a sense that's the failure to kind of really realize we haven't been treating it like that for an awfully long time. And we agree, treat it as a health issue, but don't buy into the false choice that says it's either prohibition or commercialization, but rather we can have this health and education process without changing the law. After all, we have health programs for drink driving, for speeding. They're illegal activities, but we still use health and education to try and change those behaviors. What's certainly true, what we agree on is this, that the law has a very low power to make or stop people acting a certain way. And so we can't use the law as the instrument. We have to work hard to convince young people, hey, this is actually harmful. Now, here's the thing. In the states that legalize, in places like Canada, the research now says that young people no longer see cannabis as a risk-taking behavior. That's the problem with legalization. In their mind, it's hard for them to imagine it's really, truly risky. I mean, after all, imagine an educator, communicator gets up at high school and says, cannabis is dangerous. And the teenagers think, well, hold on, it can't be that dangerous. So walk past a cannabis shop on the way to school.
Yep. Good point. Now, you mentioned the point earlier about I quoted it here, the broken logic that you've heard from people around, we're bringing the legislation in, but it's actually we're going to inform young people and we're going to safeguard them from exposure to cannabis by keeping it at the age of 20. And, somehow the legislation is going to prevent and reduce harm to our young people. Again, unpack that a little bit further, because you mentioned in your presentation about the harm that's done to people under 25. And I think that is a very key issue for us. And my question is, I suppose, have they unpacked how they will monitor that and how they will safeguard younger people in providing this legislation?
Well, I think people get nervous, and I noticed the head of the Drug Foundation looking rather flustered when Heather Duplessis-Allen from ZB was pressing him on the point of how can a teenager be stopped from taking some of the plant that their parents are growing in the backyard and using it? To which he replied, well, we're just relying on people to be good parents. So essentially, we're down to the honesty box now as about the only sort of safeguard for this kind of behavior. So I've got to simply ask, hey, none of us can look into the crystal ball, but let me ask you this. What do you reckon? In a world where the black market still exists, where there'll be now 420 shops where all you have to do is find an older friend or sibling to buy you cannabis, where there'll be homes where up to 4 plants will be being grown, are we really expecting teenage use to go down in that environment? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me that could be true. And of course, the overseas experience is it isn't true. And the effect's so devastating. In Washington State, for example, they've had over 100% increase in calls to their poison center. This is an interesting thing that we've noticed happening. We see an increase in hospitalizations, emergency room visits, but calls to poison centers. And it's teenagers who are trying edible products often that are high potency and that's induced psychosis or a panic attack. And the poor kid thinks they're dying and is ringing the poison line saying, I think I might be dying. So these sorts of health results are becoming increasingly common. In Canada, every single day, 30 teenagers are admitted to hospital for their reactions to cannabis every day.
Yeah, no, thanks for the response to that one. We are going to move on to our next speaker shortly, but you'll find, everyone, on the bottom of the screen is a chat function. We will allow some time after the end of our two speakers for a bit of Q&A, a bit of dialogue. Some of you might want to speak out a question, but you can also use the chat function to write out a question, which I'm happy to read out to either Aaron or Richard afterwards. So make use of that, or write down a question you'd like to ask Aaron specifically from the presentation you've heard tonight, or other questions you may have. So thanks again, Aaron. Appreciate that very much. We'll come back to you shortly. So we're now going to invite Richard to bring our second presentation now. So I'm going to maybe again, we'll put Richard on the speaker view. However, I will be putting up a PowerPoint that Richard will be speaking to. So let me put that on now. Richard, would you prefer to have that on straight away?
Sure, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you. Aaron mentioned before that the New Zealand Medical Association was opposed to the cannabis issue, and it is also very much opposed to the euthanasia issue, but I'll come to that in a moment. I thought that I would take you through a PowerPoint presentation as quickly as I can, but I just wanted to say at the very outset that this is what we have been asked to vote on, is the changing of a law that we've had since we first became a country, and in fact for many hundreds of years before then. We're talking about changing the law in a most profound way. In fact, probably the most profound changes to our law that we have ever seen in our lifetime, and indeed in the history of New Zealand. We've been asked to vote to allow effectively doctors who are assisted or authorised by our government to end the lives of their patients in certain circumstances. That is then going to mean that we're going to have to amend the Crimes Act and many other acts as well in order to facilitate that. We are talking about ending the lives of people for the first time in our country, and it is going to have a profound impact on the law, on our doctors and on the medical profession. It's also going to have a profound impact on our society, and I can assure you it will have a profound impact on you and your families if this law passes. If perhaps we could move to the first slide, Neil. Now, each of you may have differing views on euthanasia, and that's fine. Some of you might be opposed, some of you might be for, some of you might not yet have made up your mind. I'm not here to challenge your views on euthanasia. I'm here to tell you what happens when we try to wrap a law around euthanasia. You see, this is not a referendum on the rights or wrongs of euthanasia. New Zealanders aren't being asked, do you think euthanasia is a good thing or a bad thing? New Zealanders are being asked whether a particular law that has been drafted and passed by our Parliament should come into force in New Zealand. We move to the third slide. The problem with this law is that it is dangerous. It is far too risky, and it is flawed in multiple respects. And this law is opposed by a number of leading individuals and organisations who are assisting the vulnerable in New Zealand. And that includes the New Zealand Disability Rights Commissioner, the New Zealand Medical Association, the Australian and New Zealand Palliative Care Society, the Australian New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine, Palliative Care Nurses New Zealand, Hospice New Zealand, and the Salvation Army. There are about 1,700 doctors who have also openly voiced their strong opposition to it. And even people who, in theory, as I said before, amongst our own group of lawyers, who support euthanasia in principle, are deeply concerned about this act and are resolutely opposed to it because of the way that it's been drafted and because of the impact that we say it will have on vulnerable and weak New Zealanders. let's go to the next slide, because I'm going to spend this presentation giving you 3 key reasons why we say, or we ask you to vote no at the upcoming referendum. The first is that the idea that New Zealanders are actually going to be given choice through this law is actually false. Now, the Act and its supporters talk about the Act giving choice to people who are dying. It's the my life, my choice mantra. Now, the whole underlying premise of that law, of that notion, rests on what we say is a fallacy, that New Zealanders equally have the same choices available to them. You see, choice is actually quite an empty, vacuous term to even use in this country, because choice is not a level playing field in New Zealand. In New Zealand, powerful and privileged people, they get choice. And vulnerable, poor people don't get true choice. Their choices are much more limited, or in fact, they're non-existent. You see, what the New Zealand public are being asked to vote for here is something that the New Zealand government and our healthcare system cannot possibly deliver equitably. Look at the state for a moment of our healthcare system and our society. Okay, we have inequities in the delivery of palliative care services across the country. Okay, if you live in some parts of the country, you can access very poor, or you can't access any palliative care compared to if you live in other parts. We've got Māori claiming before the Waitangi Tribunal that the healthcare system is sick and racist. Māori who are over disproportionately represented, just as they are in our cannabis statistics, they are disproportionately represented in our terminal illness, in our disability, in our chronic illness, in our mental health, and in particular, in our suicide statistics. Third, we've got terminally ill people who are being denied Pharmac funding to keep them alive. Okay, we've got articles like this one recently of people who can't get Pharmac funding, for example, to keep them alive for many years through medication that could protect them or keep them alive for some years, even if they have things like lung cancer. We've got widespread loneliness and marginalisation in our society. We know from an Otago University study that 1 in 5 elderly New Zealanders suffer from extreme loneliness. We've got rampant elder abuse. We know that at least 90,000 elderly people in New Zealand are victims of elder abuse. And a lot of that abuse comes from their children and their family and whānau, and some of it also comes from their institutions. 50% of that abuse is financial. 80% of that abuse, at least, is psychological. And finally, we've got widespread institutional abuse against our elderly. We see rest home after rest home in our media at the moment in recent years, with reports of elderly being abused or neglected in some way by institutions. Now, into this growing toxic mess, if you like, we are about to consider throwing the end-of-life choice bomb. And that act, that new law, if it comes into force, is going to apply to everyone who is terminally ill. Okay, it's going to, now, privileged Kiwis, people who have medical insurance, who have good access to palliative care, they'll get their choice under this act. But what will the poor and the weak and the neglected and the vulnerable get? You see, there are hundreds or thousands of terminally ill Kiwis at the moment who, as I said, can't get access to proper palliative care. So what choice are they going to have if they become terminally ill and eligible for euthanasia? We have thousands of terminally ill people in New Zealand being denied Pharmac funding for medication that could keep them alive for years. And they're going to find themselves suddenly eligible for euthanasia. So what choice will they have? You see, what New Zealanders are being asked to vote for at this referendum is a system that is going to be telling these poor terminally ill people who are being failed by our health system and by our society, look, we can't care for you, but we can help you to end your life if you want to, because after all, it's your life, your choice. Now, what choice are these people really going to have? And so choice is actually a vacuous term. And let's look at briefly at what choice means overseas in the jurisdictions where euthanasia is legal. In Canada last year, according to the Canadian annual report on the euthanasia law, they've only had a law for 4 years, by the way. Last year, nearly 14% of Canadians who chose euthanasia said that one of the main reasons they chose it was because they were lonely or isolated. Was their choice a true choice? We know also that 34% of those Canadians who chose euthanasia said that one of their main reasons was because they felt that they were a burden on their family, friends, and caregivers. Did they make a true choice? And that's really the question. Is it compassionate to end the life of a person who just doesn't want to be a bother? Could we look at the next slide? In May 2018 in Canada, the Royal College of Practitioners in Quebec warned the health minister that because of a shortage of palliative care services in Quebec, there were thousands of citizens there at risk of being forced to choose euthanasia because they couldn't get proper health care. Where was their choice? If we move to the next slide, and we move also to another jurisdiction, this is the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon. Last year in Oregon, over 50% of those terminally ill people who were helped in their suicide said that one of their main reasons was that they were a burden on their family and caregivers. How is that a choice? There is no compassion or choice in assisting someone to die who doesn't want to be a burden. Also in Oregon, we know that 63 to 66% of all assisted suicides in the last 5 years were of people on low incomes who were accessing state health insurance through the Oregon Health Plan. And that health plan, that same institution, has denied some coverage to some terminally ill people for their chemotherapy or their drug treatments, and has instead offered to pay for the drugs that enable them to commit suicide. Where was their choice? You see, what the experience of euthanasia overseas actually shows us is that for vulnerable people, there is little or no choice. And that this so-called right to die, for some, can very quickly become a duty to die for many others. Let's look at the next slide and the next reason why we say this act is dangerous. And that is because it won't adequately protect vulnerable New Zealanders from being manipulated and pressured into requesting euthanasia. And that's no surprise, because that's been the experience overseas as well. Let's look briefly at overseas, at the countries that have legalized euthanasia, and see how the weak and the vulnerable in those countries have been impacted. Because every euthanasia law that has been passed, put into effect overseas, has resulted in abuse of the vulnerable. In the Netherlands, just 2 years ago, this is a country that's had a euthanasia regime for about 20 years, a country where they're euthanizing children, where they're euthanizing newborn babies, where they're euthanizing dementia patients, psychiatric patients, people. A Dutch woman with dementia was, who refused to be euthanized, was drugged and held down by her doctor and her family and given.
Sorry, Richard, I just need to unmute you there. There we go. Sorry about that. Just trying to, again, if we can just keep all of our phones on and links on silent, just so that there's no interference, that would be great. Sorry, Richard, we'll go back just to sharing that screen again.
That's fine. We've just looked at the situation in the Netherlands, and let's look now at the situation in Belgium. You see, in Belgium, where again they're euthanizing children and psychiatric patients and people who are depressed and people with bipolar and schizophrenia disorders, where they're euthanizing transgender people. The review committee there, this is a committee that is supposed to oversee the process and make sure that it's fair and safe, has been exposed as corrupt by one of its own members, who said that the committee is actually breaking the law because it's protecting and giving impunity to doctors who are also involved in the committee. So that's the situation in Belgium. What about the next slide? let's look at the situation in Canada. In Canada, if you go to the next slide there.
I'm just going to swap that over. Sorry, just stopped sharing. So let me just go back to that screen. Let's see if I can do it again. No, for some reason it's just frozen up. Let me...
I can keep going anyway because I've got the
the
articles here. So in Canada, we've got an awful situation as well. In just 4 years, we've got a number of reports of vulnerable people being targeted. Here's the case of Roger Foley, who was a chronically sick man in hospital. The hospital was unable to give him the care that he needed, and doctors then started to secretly suggest to him that he should apply for euthanasia. We've got the case of, sorry, that's Roger Foley there. We've got the case here of Candice Lewis, 25-year-old woman with spina bifida and chronic illness, also pressured by the hospital into choosing euthanasia. The case of Sean Taggart, this was a man who suffered from ALS, and the Canadian healthcare system refused to pay for all the care that he needed, but it offered to pay for his euthanasia. And in the end, he was forced to take it. We know, as I said before, that in May 2018, the Quebec College of Physicians said that told the Minister of Health that the lack of palliative care services in Quebec was forcing people to choose euthanasia. We know from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that she had condemned the euthanasia law in Canada, and she had said that I am extremely concerned about the implementation of this law from a disability perspective. She said, and I quote, "I've received worrisome claims about people with disabilities in institutions being pressured to seek medical assistance and dying," that's euthanasia, "and practitioners who are not formally reporting cases involving people with disabilities." And in response to all of those reports, what has the Canadian government done? It's expanding the law. Now it's going to apply the law to non-terminally ill Canadians and to disabled Canadians. If we move to the next slide, against this background, let's have a look at the End of Life Choice Act. This is the act that we've been asked to vote on, because it's claimed safeguards or protections for detecting whether vulnerable people are being pressured or coerced into choosing euthanasia are woefully inadequate. You see, this law puts the whole burden of detecting whether a person's being pressured onto a single doctor who may not even know the patient, who may have only met them a few times. And then it tells that doctor, all you have to do is do your best to detect whether the person is acting under pressure. Those are the exact words. Do your best. It's like a classic Kiwi euphemism, isn't it? Just do your best, mate. And that is the test. That's all that they're required to do. And in doing their best to detect coercion or pressure, the doctor can only speak to those members of the patient's family that the patient authorises them to speak to. And they can only speak to some of the patient's doctors who regularly see them. But what about if the patient doesn't have any regular doctors? And so that's the extent of the coercion or the pressure test under this law. Now, the New Zealand Royal College of General Practitioners, now these are the doctors who are going to be on the front line of this process. They told the Select Committee that they won't be able to detect coercion or pressure in every case, and that wrongful deaths are going to result under this law. And that's straight from the horse's mouth. And so really the question is, how many wrongful deaths are we prepared to tolerate under this law if it passes? How many innocent people who are pressured into being euthanized or helped to end their lives are we prepared as a nation to cope with? You know, just 3 or 4 decades ago, we abolished capital punishment in New Zealand because we could not stand the idea that one innocent man or woman might be executed if they were innocent. And now we're proposing a law that is going to potentially end the lives of many innocent and vulnerable people. So that's a real concern to us. The third and final argument that I wanted to raise to you is on the next slide, and that is this. And that is that if the Act passes into law, this is not going to be the end of the conversation. This is just going to be the beginning. Some people call this argument the slippery slope argument, and they attack it because they say there's no basis and no reason for a slippery slope. It's not going to get worse. Well, I don't call it a slippery slope. I just simply call it a logical progression. And I quote here the editor of The Australian, Paul Kelly, who wrote in 2016 this, I think, very prophetic forecast of what a euthanasia law does. And he said this: experience in other jurisdictions leads to the unambiguous conclusion the threshold event is the legalization of euthanasia. And after that, there's only one debate, and that's over how and when to expand the sanctioned killings. Because if you sanction killing for end-of-life pain relief, how can you deny that right to people who aren't dying? If you give it to adults, how can you deny it to children? If you give it to people in physical pain, how can you deny it to people in mental pain? And if you give it to people with mental illness, how can you deny it to people who are just tired of living? And I note in that regard that just 3 weeks ago, a Dutch politician tabled a new bill in their parliament to expand their euthanasia law to anybody over the age of 65 who is tired of living. You see, logically, if we legalize euthanasia just for terminal illness, we cross the Rubicon. Bear in mind that euthanasia in New Zealand, if it's going to pass under this law, euthanasia is going to become a legal right. It's going to become a valid healthcare service. And what happens if you give people this legal right to some, but you deny it to others? You see, in Canada, no sooner had the ink dried on their law that there were multiple court challenges on the grounds that their law was discriminatory. Why are some terminally ill people getting this right and not non-terminally ill people? Why can you give it to people who are in physical pain but not people who are in mental pain, mental illness? Now, the author of this law, David Seymour, says, he brags, he says, no country that's ever legalized euthanasia has ever gone back. Well, that's because with the euthanasia law, there is no going back. There is actually only one direction. The only logical trajectory of a euthanasia law is expansion. It's the logical trajectory of it for the very reasons that I've just explained. And in every country where euthanasia has been legalized, we have seen just that. We've seen an expansion of the criteria, either legislative expansion or interpretative expansion. In Canada, where they've only had the law for just 4 years, the legislative expansion is already underway, as I've just explained. It only took 4 years. In the Netherlands, we've seen a very loose law in effect for the last 20 years, but we've seen growing interpretative expansion of that law. We've got a protocol that extended that law to severely disabled newborn infants. We've seen an extension since 2010 of more and more euthanasia deaths to people with dementia. We've seen an increase in the number of euthanasia deaths of people with mental illness, alcoholism, and so on. And as I said just before, now they want to expand it to people over the age of 65 or 75 who feel that they've come to the end of their life and want to die. And in Belgium, across the border, we've seen legislative expansion. I know that in 2014, they expanded the criteria there to children, no age limit. At least 3 children, I think one aged 9, one aged 11, and one aged 17 have been euthanized since that time. And we've seen an interpretative expansion in Belgium with more and more euthanasia deaths of people with mental illness. In the South American country of Colombia, in 2018, they expanded their law to extend to children over the age of 6. And so we have to ask ourselves as a society, with this expansion, which is almost certainly going to happen, how will we look as a society in 5, 10, 15 years' time if we vote for this act? You've all heard the old maxim that evil flourishes when good people do nothing. I know that you're all good people. So I just ask, please do nothing. Please don't do nothing. Because as Martin Luther King once said, our lives begin to end the day that we fall silent about the things that matter. This proposed law matters. It matters to you, to your families, to your communities. And I ask that you stand with us in opposing it. Thank you.
Great. That's very insightful, Richard, so thank you for that. I'm going to just pose a couple of questions to you. First one is, you mentioned that you're part of a group of lawyers. Some of them would be anti-euthanasia, and some would be anti the way it's languaged or proposed. So there's two groups even within that wider community that you're part of. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
So,
yep,
so the question is, what would you as a group want to be seeing? Obviously, you're all opposed to the current legislation. What would you like to see happen?
Well, the problem is this, that the New Zealand public are now being asked to vote on a law that has already been passed, and that the only triggering event for that law to come into effect is for the New Zealand public to vote as a majority in its favour. And what we say is that there's no more time to change the law. It's too late to amend it. This is the law that we have, and it is dangerous, and it is unfortunately going to kill a lot of vulnerable Kiwis. And so all we can do at this stage is to urge New Zealanders not to vote for it. I know that this is a complex and divisive topic, and of course, if this law is voted down at referendum, I'm sure there'll be another one to take its place. That's fine. We will then have a discussion as a nation about the efficacy and safety of that particular law. But at the moment, we are only being asked to deal with the law that is in front of us. That's the law that we've been asked to vote on, and that is the law that we are resolutely opposed to.
That's helpful. Thank you for that, Richard. Now, you mentioned also that in Canada, which you've drawn from some of the points there, their legislation only came into effect about 4 years ago, if I recall that correctly. And yes, now we're starting to see this slippery slope kind of dynamic coming into play. How does Canada's situation compare with the legislation here? And what is there a comparison, or is it different?
It's very similar. It's very similar indeed. In fact, it's probably the legislation that is most similar to the one that's proposed in New Zealand. They've borrowed a lot of the same terminology from the Canadian Act has been put into the End of Life Choice Act. Mm-hmm. It was also limited in Canada to mostly to people with a terminal illness. It was a kind of a loose phrase of whether the person could say they had a reasonable foreseeability of death. Those were the words, but very loosely applied, that particular criterion. And as we've now seen, social consciousness has very quickly shifted with the new law, with more and more people who are not terminally ill, but who claim that they are suffering unbearably in some way, now standing up and saying, we want this law to be expanded to people with chronic illness, expanded to people with disabilities, expanded to younger people, expanded to people who make what we call an advanced directive. So say you've got Alzheimer's and currently you're competent, but in 5 or 6 years' time you won't be competent when you're almost about to die. They want to be able to make it an advanced directive directing that they would be permitted to have their lives ended later. The problem is, what if they in their altered mind change their mind at the date of death? What happens when a person, as we've seen in Holland, who is in advanced stages of Alzheimer's, suddenly says, I don't want to die. But the doctor says, no, we're going to end your life right now because 6 years ago you said that you would like to. These are the kinds of very, very concerning issues that we're seeing arising in these other countries, such as Canada and Belgium and the Netherlands.
Okay, no, thank you for that response. Now, obviously, there are people opposed to the legislation for a range of reasons. One of them is it's not poorly worded, or it's concerning some of the aspects that's written into the Act. Others would be opposed to it on moral or spiritual grounds and so on. But I have heard the argument that for people that are supported, quite an emotive argument that says, well, we wouldn't keep animals alive that are suffering. We would put them out of their misery. And surely, if we do that for an animal, a pet that we love, how much more for a human being that is in, pain and distress? That's quite an emotive kind of argument. What's your response to that, Richard?
It's an emotive. It's actually a very poor analogy. I mean, we put animals out of their misery if they bite the next door neighbour's child. Are we going to do the same for humans? It's a poor analogy, and I think no one in New Zealand is denying for a moment that human life has great value, has much greater value than animal life. The problem is this: that once we change the law and say that it is okay in a very limited set of circumstances to end the life of someone, then there is no logical reason why that cannot expand to other people. And this is the slippery slope that we have seen overseas. We do indeed cross the Rubicon. There is no going back, and there is only one way to go, and that is going to be expansion. And so if you genuinely believe that we are going to limit this law just to terminal illness, then you're sadly deluded, because that is not what's going to happen. This sets in chain a series of events that once we cross that Rubicon, we are not able to reverse. And in fact, we will not be able to really stop the expansion of it.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned before that there is a whole bunch of other groups, in addition to your own, that are particularly some of the health and disability groups that are quite opposed to this legislation. I know, having heard from some medical professionals, and my own members of my family are medical professionals, the concern of this legislation and the pressure it will place upon people who are actually in healthcare to look after people's well-being, not actually terminate their life. What are you hearing from others? What other groups? Can you speak a bit more about that issue and the concern from those groups around this legislation?
Well, that's right. Doctors are extremely concerned about this. We have polls in New Zealand that say that the majority of New Zealanders are supportive, although those polls are starting to change. 75% previously said they were supportive. Now that's down to 63%. I think what's happening is that more and more New Zealanders are starting to realise this is a really dangerous piece of legislation, and that those poll numbers are changing. But what the poll numbers are that Mr. Seymour and his supporters never tell the New Zealand public about are the polls of doctors. You see, doctors, 52 to 58% of our GPs and 80% of our palliative care practitioners are totally or strongly opposed to euthanasia. They don't want to have a bar of it. That's why 1,700 doctors have stood up and said, this act is wrong, we're not going to be a part of it, we don't support this. We're not in the business of killing our patients, we're in the business of caring for them. But Mr. Seymour and this particular law says to those doctors, I don't care about your views. I am going to force every single doctor in this country to go along with this law. You must go along with it. And if you don't, you'll be prosecuted. And I will give full criminal and civil immunity to those of you, those doctors who are prepared to go along with this. And I've designed a system of secrecy and cover-up and concealment to make sure that any wrongful deaths you'll probably get away with. This is the problem with this law, is that not only do we have these failures in protection of vulnerable people, but we're not even going to know as a New Zealand public what's actually going on with the law, because the whole thing is just covered up in secrecy. And so doctors are resolutely opposed and really, really concerned about what it's going to mean for the medical profession and so on.
No, agreed. Now, my understanding of the reading of the Act and some of the information there is that doctors will have the ability, obviously they cannot raise this issue with their patient. A patient must raise it themselves. But if they do, that they have the ability to be a conscientious objector in that sense and say that they cannot give support and refer that their patient to another GP. Is that my understanding?
No, not quite. It's complicated, but yes, doctors can raise a conscientious objection. They can say, I don't want to, I'm not going to be a part of this process. But then the law then says to them, you must then refer the patient or tell the patient of their right to contact what we call the SENS committee, the SENS group. Now, the SENS group is a group of doctors who have put their hands up as being doctors willing to help people to end their lives. And so a conscientious objecting doctor, any doctor with a well-informed conscience is going to say, I'm not going to refer the person to the SENS group. I'm not going to be a part of this process in any way, shape or form. And if you are asking me or telling me that I must tell the patient, look, I can't help you, I refuse to help you, but there are some people down here who could help you to kill yourself, the doctor will say, no way, I'm not going to do that. And we know that a lot of doctors are opposed to this. And so we're going to have a lot of doctors who are going to be effectively breaking the law. And so the conscientious objection right is actually curtailed and limited in the Act. And that's a real concern. As for the requirement or the prohibition, as you mentioned before, on doctors initiating a discussion with people about euthanasia, that's actually totally inconsistent with the whole purpose of the Act in Section 3 of the Act. The Act says that it is here to give people the option of assisted suicide. And yet, on the other hand, it tells doctors, you can't give the people, the patient, the option of assisted suicide. It just makes no sense. And it can't possibly stay part of the Act for long, because it makes no sense for a government to say, we're going to create this new healthcare service, but doctors can't tell people about the existence of it. It's an absurdity. And so what we're going to see is a lot of doctors and DHBs finding a variety of ways to get around that prohibition. I'm sure they will, because what people don't really quite understand yet is that euthanasia is not going to be regarded as some kind of extreme measure that's way out here, it's only brought in for the most extreme cases. That's not going to be the case. Euthanasia is going to be one of the options clearly and squarely on the table for anybody who is terminally ill who meets the criteria. And there are a variety of ways that doctors and the healthcare system will go about making sure that people know about the existence of that right. And particularly in a time like now, when the government and our DHBs are coming under increasing financial strain. We've got growing numbers of elderly, growing numbers of people who are living longer and being sick and being dependent on the healthcare system. This government, a future government, is simply going to wake up one day and say, we can't afford to keep everybody alive. And this is where I get very concerned about future economic policies and financial disincentives to DHBs in our health system to actually care for their patients, rather than just starting to find ways to help them to check out early.
Wow, very interesting information, Richard. You obviously know your stuff well, as does Aaron. Just a follow-up question related to doctors who would become or are conscientious objectors, because I like you, I understand there's quite a large number. What is the implication if they don't refer a patient? Say they want nothing to do with it. What is the act? What is the consequence going to be for them?
The Act makes it clear that if a doctor fails to comply with a requirement of the Act, they commit an offence which is punishable by 3 months imprisonment or a $10,000 fine, or both. Now, it is a requirement of the Act that if they conscientiously object, they must inform the patient of that patient's right to contact the SENS group.
Okay.
And I know that a lot of doctors are going to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be a part of facilitating a person's suicide. And so we're going to have a lot of doctors who are going to be breaking the law.
Yeah.
And that's a collision course that is going to be coming.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Richard, thank you for your presentation to us. It's been very insightful. What we're going to do now is we're going to move to a time of Q&A. So I'm just going to adjust the gallery view here. Now, if you have a question, what we want you to do is you are able to write that question in. Again, if you look down at the bottom of the screen, there is a chat function, and you can write a question there that can go to everyone. And if that's the case, what I will do is then read that question out, and if you didn't want to ask it yourself. However, you may have a question you do want to ask yourself and you're wanting to do so, what we will do is just simply take you off mute, and I'll just get you to raise your hand, just like that, to ask a question if you want to do that verbally. Now, I already see that a question has come through here. Let me read that out. And again, please send some more through. This is a question for Richard. Given that the EOLCA is already an act passed in New Zealand, but awaiting an over 50% yes votes to come into effect, what is the legal outcome of that act if the 50% yes threshold is not met in the referendum? Will the act be repealed? So, Richard.
If they don't meet if the majority of voters don't vote it through, then the act doesn't pass, and that's it. It's over.
Okay.
And then the supporters of the act will have to go and draft something else that they can then try to take through the next parliament. But no, so the answer to your question is no. The act won't be repealed. It's gone.
Okay. So I gather that if it is repealed, then yes, there will be further approaches made, I'm sure, into the future on this one. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments for either Richard or Aaron regarding their two presentations to us? Again, just we can take you off mute. In fact, I will do that. Let me just.
I had a question for Aaron, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, please go for it.
I'm just interested to know what where are the polls sitting at the moment on the cannabis issue? I'm not sure if you mentioned that in your presentation. I was sort of in and out, but where are things? Because I heard that they were looking more favourable for your supporters, your side than the other side at the moment. Is that the case?
Yeah, interesting. Today, TVNZ published the results of that compass tool that people have been using, and that had the yes vote at 50%. Although I know to our team that actually a lot of older voters don't use things like the Compass app to work out who to vote for, because they're not featured. So the rest of the national polling has it at very close or us ahead. We are doing some internal polling that we are using a market research company for. It has the no vote at 55% and the yes down at around 34. So mostly it looks like it's pretty much neck and neck with the no vote slightly ahead.
Good to know, thank you.
Okay. Now, Aaron, I will unmute you as well because I want to ask you a question. You did mention before that this has been a kind of a baptism by fire. I'd be interested to know what it's been like stepping into this scene with all the different perspectives and the political issues involved. How's that been for you?
What's been fascinating has been the way in which often the debate is kind of unfair. For example, there have been a couple of debates where it's been me versus 2 yes people. Take the ZB debate on Wednesday night. It was 2 yes people, the Police Association president who's neutral, and myself. So it was me against 2 yes people. That's kind of tiring. They kind of double the rights of reply, very exhausting. That's not so bad. I think I found what's difficult is that the passion with which people hold their position comes out in rather aggressive ways. And because I moderate the Say No to Dope Facebook page, every day of my life for the last 3 months, I have been called the worst swear words I've ever heard. In fact, in any 1 week, I'd be called words I would never mention in public, more swear words about me as a person than my whole adult life combined, just in a week block.
Wow.
And so that's been difficult to get used to, is that people are so very angry at the thought that we are kind of spoiling their fun, that it's meant that the process has been rather draining. So like I say, my body kind of knows it should have been an election yesterday. And so with a month to go, I'm kind of like taking some deep breaths because we've still got a bit to go.
And so what does that look like for you over the next month? What's on your agenda then in that regard?
Well, as you would well understand, given that this event was going to be live and is now on Zoom, there's a few events like that still to come. Next weekend, I'll be in Christchurch speaking at Grace Vineyard. 3 services on the Sunday in Christchurch. And then it kind of slows right down at the minute. So we wait to see now whether there'll be some more media engagement we've noticed that the media is very reluctant to engage with the no campaigns. It's interesting. There are registered, referendum campaigns. There are 9 registered yes campaigns and 2 registered no campaigns. Say No, Don't, and Family First, who of course are promoting both referendum and their referendum events around the country. So it's very much stacked against us, and yet somehow the public have gotten the idea that this is probably bad news.
Okay, good that that is happening. What about for you, Richard? Have you encountered opposition to your stance personally, or the group that you're representing?
Oh, absolutely. Both, actually. Okay. I think the very first thing that we have noticed in the media, in particular in the last couple of years on this issue, has been a real opposition to us in the media. And we've really felt that the media has been biased on this issue for quite a few years, and has always given a very long and lengthy platform to people like David Seymour, who can go on to primetime TV on News Hub and speak for 10 minutes, uninterrupted, unadulterated support for his bill and his act, and often without opposing or dissenting voices being presented on the other side. That's the first thing. So we have seen, I suppose, a real slant towards giving a lot of airtime to people who are in favour, and very little to people who are opposed. The second thing I've seen is a portrayal of people like myself as religious loonies, and that's okay. People are entitled to their opinion, but what I simply say is that what we are actually. I'm actually a spokesperson for a group of lawyers who have a variety of religious and non-religious opinions. We're not a religious organisation. We don't poll our members on their religious views or non-religious views. I don't care what their religious views are. In fact, my spokesperson is an atheist. That's fine. We're only worried about legal opinions, and those are the opinions that we explain. And our legal view is very clear that we are opposed. We have very good reasons for it. Yeah,
it's very sad when that it becomes personal and there's the vitriol that gets poured out, and particularly that argument that somehow this is a faction or a Christian person, somehow that's an agenda where no one else does have an agenda. It's
that's right.
dynamic. Yeah,
the Christians have the religious have an agenda and the non-religious don't. Yes,
that's right. Sorry,
it has been quite ad hominem, and it's often sort of this idea of let's shoot the messenger rather than listen to the message, and it's unfortunate, but it won't stop us.
No, good on you. Well, you're both doing an amazing job, and have really appreciated your presentation tonight. Now, I see another question has come through for Richard. I'm certainly put one out there for Aaron as well. Do you have enough advertising and TV shows on media that speak about the dangerous aspects of the bill, like you have mentioned in your presentation, or is it bias? Well, you mentioned the bias, but what are you doing and what is planned even over this coming month in terms of how this will be promoted?
There are actually a number of different groups who have stepped out in opposition to the Act, which is great. And I think you'll be seeing in particular in the next few weeks from other groups, you'll be seeing quite a lot of advertising and media on this issue. And I do really hope that the media engages with them, because their campaigns are far from over. Our own particular campaign, we're just actually updating our website, because we had spent a lot of our efforts previously when the Act was at the parliamentary stage. We had done our best to convince parliamentarians that it was unsafe and dangerous. But now we're going to have to refocus, obviously, our attention on the New Zealand public. So we're just revamping our website, and we'll be up and running again this week. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, just one final call for any further questions, either verbal. So if you can unmute yourself, I believe. Is that correct? I'll just make sure I haven't locked everyone out from that opportunity, or to put through a written question. So let me just make sure. I'll just unmute everyone just to give everyone a chance to speak, just in case you're locked out for some reason. All Any questions at all?
Yes, my question is, do you have a profile of those who are yes to the two issues?
Can you repeat that again, Magdalene?
Do you have a profile of those who are yes to the two issues? Are they the intelligentsia? Are they, who are they?
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The End of Life Choice Act grew out of the Lucretia Seals case, which was taken before the courts back in 2014, 2015. Lucretia Seals was a lawyer based in Wellington, and she rubbed shoulders with various parliamentarians and various legal firms. Russell McVeigh, we all know who they are. They're probably the largest, most powerful legal firm in the country. They have a pro bono legal budget of $1 million. They acted for Lucretia Seals for free. They were the ones actually who drafted the End of Life Choice Bill. And that's an open secret that they were the ones who drafted it. But David Farrar, after the bill passed, then congratulated everybody at Russell McVeigh for all of their drafting work. So what does that mean? What I say is this, that the End of Life Choice Act has been drafted by the rich and the powerful and the privileged for themselves. It's for themselves, but it applies to everybody. And it applies to the people who are weak, defenseless, and powerless and vulnerable as well. And that is the problem, is that if you are in the Russell McVeigh camp, you have a lot of choice. You have private medical insurance. You live in a catchment area that's got good access to palliative care. You do have a true choice. But if you're not in that category, then your choices are more limited. And this whole idea of my life, my choice is just one big illusion.
Thank you. That's great. Any further questions?
Aaron. Yeah, can you answer the question as well?
Sure. Like, I think one of the things that the Yes campaign is struggling with is that oftentimes when images are shown of people using cannabis, there's a particular subculture that's being shown, people with a certain hairstyle and certain sort of dress sense that don't look like ordinary Kiwis. But I think that there is a kind of another urban kind of intellectual group who very much see themselves as, again, in a similar way, that they know that in a sense they can get away with it. It's interesting actually that longitudinal study out of Dunedin said that there was an average 8 IQ drop for heavy users. Now, if you're a university educated person, you can probably get away with losing 8 IQ points. But if you have an IQ of 100, that pushes you down into an area of IQ function. That means that your life outcomes are going to change. So in a similar kind of way, those who are educated, those who have less outcomes, who are more resilient, more high functioning, they know that they're getting away with having their joint on the weekend. They're not really concerned about those whose social and economic and educational outcomes will be very different for them. So very similar kind of problem.
Interesting. Thank you, Magdalene. Did you have any further questions?
Yeah, I watched the Q&A and it was so apparent to me that it was really biased. And as I say, there were two, one associate professor of AUT and Chris, whatever his name is, from the Police Association, and a very, very articulate young lady representing a certain generation. And yeah, you know, it's so obvious that the media is slanted towards the yes vote on those two issues. And, you know, my idea is that, you know, yeah, it seems to me that the Christians need to be able to, in a way, I would say the word capture, but, you know, I would say that, you know, these groups of people have captured the media, and Christians have been so silent. And as what Richard said, you know, when there's an important issue, you're silent, you know, then you're actually going down the slippery path.
Okay, thanks. Is there a question there, Magdalene, or just a
No, just a comment.
an observation? Yeah. Okay, we'll just one final call for any questions, either written questions or verbal questions. One new message is coming. Let me just have a look. It's just really a comment saying thank you so much for the excellent presentations, and I think that's the note we want to finish on. You've actually presented both areas very well, and I think have informed us well on the issues. And just want to say all the best for this coming month to you both, because there'll be lots of presentations and conversations and debates and opportunities and also challenges in the media and other outlets as a result. So may you know God's grace and strength to you both in your respective capacities as you bring an informed voice to these very important issues. Both, we're hearing from you quite clearly the answer for the choice on election day is to vote no. And I've said very clearly as a pastor, it's not my prerogative to tell people how to vote for the government or for their candidate, but to be informed and make informed decisions. However, on these two referendum issues, I do think we need to have a clearer perspective as a church, which is where we're coming from, that these are important issues that we just can't just leave in the balance and say, you know, okay, sarah, whatever will be. We need to be proactive to say, actually, this is poor legislation on both accounts, and we need to have a no vote to that. So we are encouraging that, but we certainly want people to be informed, and ultimately it's their choice. But I thank you, gentlemen, for your perspective, for helping us reinforce that perspective as well. Any final words from you both before we conclude? Aaron, how about you first?
Well, certainly, look, Neil, I'd like to commend you on what you've just said, because one of the things that's been very sad in my journey around the Church of New Zealand has been the reluctance of pastors to say what you've just said. So I commend you for the courage it takes to put your stake in the stand and say this is where we are at as a community of believers, understanding, of course, that as you say, people are still free to choose as they will. I think this is an important moment on two very important issues. Beyond the fork in the road are two very different futures. And I think that we need to have that kind of sobriety of mind that recognizes that we need to be able to look beyond the fork in the road and make sure that's the New Zealand we want. Yeah,
great comments, great words. Thanks, Aaron. And Richard?
I couldn't say it any better than Aaron. Thank you, Aaron, for putting it that way. And again, as Aaron said, thank you, Neil, for pointing out to your congregation just how important these issues are, and in particular the impact that these issues are going to have on the vulnerable of our society. And I think the tenets of our faith, we all agree, compel us to consider our poorer brothers and sisters in our community. Absolutely. And on both these issues, we know that impact is going to be profound and it is going to be destructive. And so these are the kinds of considerations that we have to have at the forefront of our minds. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, we need good laws that will be for the well-being of our people and our vulnerable people. And as you both have said, this is not good legislation for our future. So we do need to be decisive and be courageous in our stance. So thank you for being on the forefront of that argument. And again, we wish you well. Pray grace upon you both, and that you be sustained. Get a well-deserved break, Aaron, after the election on the 17th of October. But thank you for your time tonight. We will, just to let you know, everyone, that we will be sending out a link to this recording for others from our wider community that haven't been able to join us tonight, as well as a PDF of both of the PowerPoint presentations that Richard and Aaron have used tonight and will have sent through to me. So I'll make those available to us. Again, it's about being informed. So you can, rather than unmute you can actually use a little function button on the bottom that is a clapping hand like that. So great thing to do, put your hands together for these guys. This is the benefit of on Zoom, right? So here you go, lots of clapping hands, gentlemen. Thank you very much. We do appreciate it. God bless you both. And thank you, everyone, for joining with us and being part of this forum referendum meeting tonight. We appreciate it. God bless you all.
Thank you.
All right. Go well.
Thank you.